This week, did a Canadian historical villain dress like a woman to sneak away? Not that there's anything wrong with that. Then, a ghost story from inside his old house in Toronto. Now I'm going to connect this to a town called Dundas. If you're not familiar, Dundas is a small town that's currently part of the city of Hamilton. It was supposed to be Hamilton. If you want to look into the history. Now, please note, if you're not from the city of Hamilton, you might not understand what I mean here. But every town in the city, Dundas, Stony Creek, Ancaster, Flamborough, to name a few, do not want to be part of Hamilton. This is true. I grew up in the city of Hamilton. I grew up in the East End. And I didn't understand this until I grew up and started studying the histories of all the surrounding old Loyalist towns, such as Dundas. And that's when I realized there was this kind of animosity against the city. And when I was growing up, it was before amalgamation. So those were actually separate towns, and then Hamilton swallowed them all up. I would assume it was for strength and for tax purposes, whatever the reason was. And you can understand that those surrounding towns were not happy about it. So Dundas has that type of history where it was kind of in competition. Like Hamilton is in competition with Toronto, Dundas was in competition with Hamilton. And one of the main reasons why Dundas didn't become the big city is because of the Desjardins Canal. If you've been on my dark trolley tour, you stood underneath that bridge there, the high-level bridge. That's the canal. So it used to go into the town of Dundas, and because that landmass was too thin for modern day boats and vessels, Hamilton Harbor became the focal point. So when they decided they were going to bring in the railway, to bring in the factories, of course Hamilton Harbor was definitely the more luxurious of the options, and Dundas fell off to the wayside. But it's still strong in our history. Because out of all the historical towns in southern Ontario that helped build British Canada, Dundas is one of the top ones. It was, considered to be the place to be back in the day. And this is what lured one of our famous villains in Canadian history to live there for a time. Now, Dundas, in a sense, has always been a place of rebels. To give you an example, during the Civil War days, yes, the American Civil War, there was no Canadian Civil War. And during the American Civil War, you had Southern sympathizers in Dundas, which is crazy, because we are definitely on the North End, if not the Great North End. And to have people who were sympathetic to the Confederation's cause, the fact that, it was... it's not completely the reason, but it was mostly around slavery. It's just mind-blowing. So just to give you an idea how the town of Dundas was kind of a rebel's town. But it was also the home of a rebel, William Lyon Mackenzie. Now you might be thinking that you recognize that name. There was a William Lyon Mackenzie King who served as Prime Minister of Canada during a very crucial time, and that was during the World War II era. So this was a time where we needed strong leaders, and I'll give it to him. And maybe because he comes from that rebellious past that made him a strong leader, he did a great job in running our country during that very dark time. So he is the grandson of the man I'm about to speak of, who I did refer to as a villain. And when it comes to how Canada eventually progressed, being against that and wanting to overthrow that, even if it meant violence, I think the classification of villain does fit for him. Maybe you disagree, maybe you don't, maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about, but I am going to explain. So in 1822, this is before the Civil War, before they would become rebellious for that reason. In 1822, William Lyon Mackenzie lived in Dundas. It's when he had first come to Canada, and he eventually started a general store with another man named Leslie. That's a last name with 2 S's. So they had a general store that used to exist at Main Street in Baldwin in Dundas. You can look it up on Google Maps. I'm told there's a funeral home there today. And it was also like, it was a general store. It sold a bunch of stuff, like everything you ever needed was there. And as well, it is technically considered the first library. They had a book exchange inside the building. So it was very much ahead of his time. And you can see that Mackenzie was somebody who was definitely a smart person. It's the only way he could become such a leader. Now, he only lasted a year in the town of Dundas, and one of the main reasons why is he got into a fight with his partner, Leslie. And I guess Leslie kept the shop. I don't know what the details are behind that. But eventually, Mackenzie's like, okay, screw this, I'm leaving. And he goes to the town of Queenston, which factors into his future as well, and then eventually ends up in the city of Toronto. Now, while he's in Toronto, this is where everything happens to the man. And it's going to be the house that I'm going to be covering later with a personal ghost story out of the house. So when he was in Toronto, he was recognized for being a very eccentric character. He was a bit of a strange sort. And the people, they saw him, they saw how he constantly spoke up against British rule. When he was in Queenston, he actually started a newspaper that was strictly against the British. So he constantly spoke against them, talked about their corruption, talked about he wanted to change that, talks about that the country itself needed a change. And you can see that the Brits themselves weren't very widely respected by their populace because the people took to him. Makes me completely able to understand why he thought a rebellion was a good idea. I mean, if you had thousands and thousands and thousands of people egging you on and saying, yeah, you should affect change. Now, most of the people who egg politicians on or folks in power don't fully mean their convictions. Let me just say that. And it might not be a popular view, but I don't think so. Because if they meant their convictions, that they would be the ones stepping to the front to lead the charge. But to say to somebody else like William Lyon Mackenzie here, you should do it. You should change things. You should bring down the British. You know, maybe that kind of stuff went to his head. To be honest, I would have loved to hear this guy speak. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to some of the meetings that were discussed before the 1837 rebellion in Canada began. I want to see what the mindset was of this man before going into it. But he did. So 1837, this is, if my math is correct, 15 years after he was in Dundas. He starts the most famous rebellion in our history. It's not massive, but it is the most famous in the sense that he was going to overthrow British rule. So he gets his rebels together and he makes an attempt and he fails. I mean, I'm not even going to drag this one out. It's not like I'm going to go like the American Civil War where there was actually a chance. You had General Lee, for example, on the opposition side is somebody that you wouldn't mess with. And he was definitely a great general. When it came to the rebellion, it was a completely failed attempt almost right from the beginning. And I mean, he had the support at first, but when they realized that it's starting to become like a blowout from what I've heard, that at this point, I'm sure a lot of those supporters, the ones I was talking about who would never lead themselves, ran for the hills because they knew what the British would do to them if they were caught, and it actually happened. Many of the leaders within the rebellion were hanged. So that's what they wanted to avoid. So if they just kind of fade back into, they're like, go, 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 William Lyon Mackenzie, take down those Brits. And then the Brits are like, here you go. And Mackenzie's like, we're losing. And then those people are like, never mind. And just walk, like fade backwards into the shadows. That's basically, I'm sure, what happened. So the rebellion fails. And Mackenzie, even though some of his leaders, some of the people underneath him, were caught and hanged, one of them in his former town of Queenston, related to the Hamilton family. I've talked about that before. Mackenzie himself became a fugitive and attempted to escape, because if they caught him, they would have definitely hanged him. It would have been a kangaroo court, and then in the end, it would have been an easy sentence of death. Very simple. But he became a fugitive. And surprisingly, he still had friends. And surprisingly, he had friends in Dundas. So here we go. We've come full circle. We're back in the town of Dundas here. So Mackenzie is on the run. He's hiding out wherever he can. And then he ends up in the town of Dundas. So I assume he still had friends there. And then they told him, we think there's a cave you can hide in. Now, from what I've seen in my research, I don't think this cave exists anymore. It was called Mackenzie's Cave. You can look it up on Google. There was articles and whatnot. So there was a cave in the woods at the top of Sydenham Hill, and it's called Mackenzie's Cave. So the rumor was that when he hid out in Dundas, which is almost a for sure, that he hid in that cave, which is a legend. Whether he was in the cave or not is a legend, but people would go visit it, and they would, feel that history. That's what they'd be thinking of when they were there. Now I'll make the main photo of this week's episode as the cave so you guys can see what it looks like. But from what I've heard, it was demolished because of safety concerns. I guess at one point it looked like it might collapse in, and because people were going to visit, you don't want to have them crushed. So he held out in that cave, not sure for how long, because again, it's just legend. But then the rumors continued on that after he left Dundas, which is not a small trek, especially in those days, by a horse-drawn carriage, you're going to trek from Dundas to the United States where he'd be safe, away from the British. He'd be with the Americans, who obviously would support him in overthrowing the British. They'd be cool with that. But to get down to there, it is said, and again, this is legend, that he had to dress like a woman. So this is what I'm going to picture. You can tell me if I'm incorrect when it comes to history standards. But if you had to travel by horse-drawn carriage, which I think he had, because if he was traveling through the cover of woods and, like running through the trees and camping where he could, then I would assume he wouldn't have to dress like a woman to escape. But if he's traveling by horse-drawn carriage on the main roads where it's much more safe and much more quick, then he would dress like a woman. That makes complete sense to me, because when they're looking at these carriages, they're trying to find him during these very tense times. They're probably having these little checkpoints where the carriages have to stop. So I can just pick, it's the most amazing image in history. There's a lot of visual images that you can have in the history of Canada, but this one takes the cake. So they probably had to have a fellow. I'm going to assume maybe he was from Dundas, who, maybe he grew out his beard to look super manly, so that they wouldn't think twice about the wife looking a little bit manly. If you don't know, they look up a picture of William Lyon Mackenzie and then picture him in a wig, and then you'll understand why I'm giggling. So you'd have to have a manly man, and then maybe a couple of kids in the back, and then you'd have the wife. Oh, glorious image. I just picture the checkpoint is just asking him. It's like, oh, where you headed, man? We're going down to the border for a visit. It's like, oh, okay, no problem. Excuse me, ma'am. Just him having to put on the voice, like it's still a deep voice. He's like, yes. Oh God, sorry. I hope this isn't too boring for you guys. I love it. I love it so much. Anyway, continuing on. So they get to the border, and they cross over. I assume it's not as guarded as it is today. Like, I'm sure there was tons of areas that you could sneak over, maybe with just a small rowboat or something. And they make Navy Island their home. So this is Mackenzie. And if you don't know Navy Island, if you know Grand Island, which is technically part of Niagara Falls, New York, just over the border there, Grand Island is where there was an amusement park there called Fantasy Island. It was on Grand Island. So Navy Island's maybe, I'm going to say 1/20th the size of Grand Island. It's the tiniest little thing. And so Mackenzie moves there. I assume he built like a log cabin or something, and he renamed Navy Island to, get this, the Republic of Canada. He calls it the Republic of Canada, and he lives there for years. Now, I assume he had some of his men there as well. I'm not too specific on that history, but they say that during that time he was planning with others to do another attack on Canada, and this time he would do it right, but it didn't matter because there was no second attack. So he just lived on his Republic of Canada for a while, and then in the city of Toronto, the British had upset the populace quite a bit, and because of this, they're asking the question, hey, remember that mayor we loved? Remember William Mackenzie? That guy was cool. We want him back. So it was popular opinion among the populace that actually opened the doors of Canada again. So this time they're bringing him back. Now, this is just a guess, but if I was the British in that case, to be able to have him safely come back, there's really only one angle to this, and that's a political angle. If you can have him come back and in the public eye make him look completely feeble, make him look completely defeated, then I can understand why the British wouldn't have hanged him. So I'm thinking as a politician in this sense is like, there's still rebels among us living in Canada, and their leader is still alive, and we can't get to him because he's being protected by the Americans. Well, now people in Toronto want him back, and he wants to come home. Well, let's just guarantee his safety. Let's bring him back and then portray him as a feeble-minded idiot. I don't know if they went that far, but portray him as not the man he used to be. And then eventually the rebels will consider, okay, it was all a mistake, and that it's obvious the British are the ones in control. And I think that's what they did. But again, that's my personal opinion from knowing the history, is that's most likely what they did. Because he comes back and then eventually he retires. And he retires not in the best health. So he retires to this house on Bond Street. That's now a Mackenzie house. It is a museum today dedicated to him. And that's where he lives the rest of his days, which wasn't too much far after that, just a few more years. And then he died in that house. So this entire story leading up to his death is an absolutely amazing story in Canadian history. And like I said, I mean, from beginning to end, whether you believed in his politics or not, the way he went about it to try and affect change, he didn't try and affect change on a political level. He went over to violence. And whenever a leader decides that he would sooner, instead of using his words and his influence to change things, that he decides instead to use violence and not caring about the death of his men, which shows me in allowing the people under him to get caught and hanged as he sneaks away dressed like a woman, tells me that he wasn't the best leader. And in this case, I do believe the term villain is definitely justified. So as I mentioned, the Mackenzie house is this really creepy looking little house. It's not that big. And it's in downtown Toronto, if you guys know where Young Dundas Square is, by the old Eaton Centre. It's right there. It's you can't see it from the main street. It's behind the scenes. Bond Street's the side street. Leads to the back area, the original entrance of St. Michael's Hospital. But it's a interesting little house. It's a creepy looking little house. So if you were to say to me that it is the most haunted house in the city of Toronto, I would 100% agree with you. I would definitely not be the majority in that status. I know a lot of people know about the ghost stories there, and the main reason is every single ghost tour in the city focuses on that place. I'm one of them. I've done a couple tours out there. The Toronto tour, which hopefully will come back next year. And I've done a couple tours out there, and I can see that how popular that place is when it comes to the ghosts. So to have those ghost stories alongside of a history that says that those ghost stories aren't real If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can definitely look that up. It tells me that there's something to it. Because if you have enough popular push on ghost stories and experiences that are happening in the house even to this very day that continue to push that supposed idea that the house is haunted, not to mention its connection with a very strange part of history and a man with a huge amount of energy. Probably not good energy, as you've already heard on this episode, but energy all the same. Now, for this ghost story inside the house, it happens to a son of the caretaker who used to look over that house. So at a time before we had the automated security systems we had today. And when you had places like that that were known throughout the city and things might happen in there, you didn't have an automated security system. You had a caretaker and his family who would usually live inside the house. So they could live in there, they could be there overnight, and they could watch over it. So it was like their house. It was like they were renting it. It was their place. So the caretaker's name was Mr. Charles Edmunds. It was him and his wife, who were up in age at that point. They were seniors. And he had a son named Robert Edmunds. Robert had a wife and some children. So this caretaker, Edmunds, and his wife were the most adamant people that experienced the ghosts inside the house. They were the ones who came forward and told many of the very vivid stories that we have today. Eventually it would be, denied and saying it was all just a publicity stunt. But again, these are real people telling stories of what they experienced. So you'd have to think they were completely paid off and that these stories are made up, but some of them are actually quite convincing. And they're kind of subtle. They're not very over the top, which if you had ghost stories being made up in the 1950s, usually they'd be very over the top. Like, yeah, the ghost came up and handed me a suitcase, and in the suitcase there was gold bullion or something like that. But no, these were the more of the ghost stories of experiences today, when we have now the internet and somebody from across the world can share their real experience. And now we have this sixth sense, so to speak. We can tell the difference between a real ghost story and a fake ghost story, because fake ghost stories are usually far over the top and harder to believe. But back then they didn't have that. So this is why one of the reasons why I can see Mr. Charles Edmunds as having real experiences inside that house. So there's one evening, this was a regular occasion that Robert and his wife and children would come visit the house. But one evening, Robert and his wife were sleeping in one of the bedrooms on the second floor. And Robert's wife shakes him awake. And he's like, well, what do you want? What do you want? And she's like, do you hear that? And he listened. And he could hear it. It was this calm, slow music coming from the first floor. It was very muffled because the bedroom door was closed. And it sounded like a piano. And he's woozy from sleep. He probably said something like, is it a radio? Maybe somebody left something on. But she's like, just go check. So reluctantly he gets out of bed. He goes into the hallway of the second floor there. And as he walks into the hallway, there he is. A shadowed silhouette of a man standing in the hallway at the top of the stairs. Now don't be too scared. It was actually just his dad. So Charles Edmunds had heard the music as well, and I'm sure Robert got quite the jump from that one, right? Already you're kind of tense. But they meet at the top of the stairs, and they don't say anything to each other. They just stand there looking at each other, and you can still hear it like it's louder in the hallway. The piano on the first floor in the parlor. There's a piano down there, and it's playing. They said it was like a slow... very like slow classical music kind of feel to it. It's kind of calm. It's definitely not over the top. And they actually stood there and listened to it for a little while. And then after a little bit, Robert, taps his father on the shoulder and says, probably just gave a signal. He's going to go downstairs. And when he turns to step on the first step, the music stopped. It didn't come back. So they stood there for a second. Then finally they go down into the parlor. And they look at the piano. It's completely untouched. The bench is still pushed in as it was left before they went to bed. And even the cover, the pianos have the cover for the keys. It's down. It's not up. I'm sure they looked around. I have no doubt that they looked around that space trying to find anything that would tell them whether there was, like a person in there, or somebody could have caused this, or a radio that could have went off, but there was nothing. And the silence at that point must have been deafening. So they just, go back to bed and try and sleep. I don't know how far into their experiences this was, but if they had ghostly experiences in the house before, I speak this from experience, is that at that point you kind of just say, oh, that's interesting, and then you go to bed and you try and sleep. And the more ghostly experiences you have in a house, the easier it is for you to sleep. If it's the first one, you're probably not sleeping that night, or you're sleeping with the lights on, one of those two things. But as you have more and more, eventually it becomes easier and easier to just pass it off. And then you're like, mental note, this is going to make a great story to tell all my friends. Now, as I mentioned, the Toronto Ghost Walk is currently up in the air right now. COVID sent us for a bit of a tizzy, but the goal is to eventually have it back in a small form by next year. So 2023, we are shooting for it. It was one of my personal faves to lead. I loved it out there. If you don't know, we featured Old City Hall. We featured the Elgin and Winter Garden Theater, St. Michael's Stories, the Mackenzie House. That area around Young Dundas Square is one of the most haunted areas ever. It's amazing to have this district of these, very coolly haunted buildings. And the stories are quite unique, and the history is definitely vivid and interesting. So I really hope that returns next year and we could, show it off for you guys. Well, that's it for the show this week. I guess I'm ending a little bit early on this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be in Niagara-on-the-Lake tonight, Wednesday, August 17th. If anybody's listening to it today and you want to come out and experience the tour, I'm going to be leading it personally. We also have the Downtown Hamilton tour going this Friday if you're interested in that. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and I'll talk to you next week.